Okay, so today we'll be discussing another form of renewable energy sources. We've tackled before the tidal hydropower, specifically tidal power. Now we're going to tackle solar energy. Now there are two main distinctions or types of collecting solar energy. One is photovoltaic plants, which uses the light energy from the sun and converts it directly into electricity using a solar cell. Now there are solar thermal systems, which use the thermal energy from the sun and uses it to boil water in order to use that to spin a turbine. Now, first we'll be tackling the photovoltaic types of solar power plants. Now, could one of you please read the meaning of the photovoltaics?
Wait lang, hindi kita eh. Wala yung slide.
Yeah, wala nga. Asa na ba yung slide sa inyo?
Dun pa din sa una. Ayan, okay na.
Yeah.
Pasahin ko na.
Hmm.
So, photovoltaic plants. This type uses the energy from the sun and converts it into electricity using the solar cell. Meanwhile, the solar thermal systems plants utilizes energy from the sun to heat a fluid to a high temperature. This fluid then transfers its heat to water, which then becomes a superheated steam. The pressure from the steam causes the turbine to turn.
Okay, thank you. Now, so photovoltaics is the conversion of light into electricity using semiconducting materials, specifically something like silicon that exhibit the photovoltaic effect phenomenon studied in physics, photochemistry, and electrochemistry. The photovoltaic effect is commercially utilized for electricity generation and as photosensors. Here we have an example of a solar cell. This type of cell is a monocrystalline cell, meaning there is it's made up of one big silicon crystal. Now we have the polycrystalline cell, which is made up of multiple silicon crystals melted together. Now we have the components of a solar cell, which is the aluminum frame to make it rigid, the tempered glass to protect it from scratches and dust, the encapsulant or EVA, the solar cell itself, another encapsulant, the back sheet, and the junction box. Now, we have more parts of the solar cell. We have glass, which is usually glass. An anti-reflection coating. We'll get to why we need an anti-reflection coating. A metal grid, an N-type and P-type silicon. We'll discuss this later. And we have the metal backing plate. Now, let's start first on what happens inside the solar cell when sunlight strikes it. For maximum efficiency to occur, the panel must absorb as many light energy as it can from the sun. The more energy it's absorbed, the more energy it can supply. The first law of thermodynamics. Now, here is the thing. Somewhere around 5% of energy from the sun is already lost due to reflection once it has hit the glass. This is why we need an anti-reflection coating, because some of the sunlight gets reflected back and does not get absorbed by the solar cells. To avoid further losses of sun's energy upon entering the glass, this is where the anti-reflection coating comes into play. Here is a scenario wherein reflection occurs. Sunlight enters into the glass and the solar cell, but gets reflected back out and does not get absorbed. This is a scenario to be avoided to prevent due to reflection. This happens when coating is incorrect. Now we have here, when the coating is the right amount, the reflected energy can be minimized, if not totally canceled. You can see the light energy goes into the solar cell, but is mostly mitigated and is not reflected back. The anti-reflection coating lets the light in, but mostly it doesn't let the light to get back. Certain manipulation is being done during manufacturing to achieve that characteristics. Now, silicon is used as a semiconductor. It's a bit shiny. Exposing it to sunlight may lose up around 30% of the sun's energy due to reflection. Another reason why we need anti-reflection coating. Nasa na ba sa inyo yung slide?
Components of a solar cell.
Components pa lang. Wait. Okay, so now here's the question. What's the main thing that is happening inside a solar cell or photovoltaic cell? That is why it is able to produce electricity when the sunlight strikes it. Could one of you please read the photovoltaic effect?
Okay, so to achieve the photovoltaic effect, we need a material which, when struck by sunlight, will exhibit some characteristic of a conductor.
Now, what
Review question. What is happening inside a copper conductor when there is no presence of voltage across it?
Okay, so now we learned in the past subjects that when a copper conductor has no presence of an electric field, or there is no EMF induced in it, the valence electron, or the electron that is in the outermost shell, is free to move and bounces from atom to atom randomly in every direction. Now, how does the solar cell work? Now, could one of you please read this line?
How do solar cell work? So that particular characteristics of a conductor where there are a number of electrons that moves freely is what you should be attained to exhibit. So the photovoltaic effect, this is where the silicon semiconductor comes. When the silicon semiconductor absorbs energy from the sun, the photons which the sunlight have could have knocked up an electron out of its orbit within an atom, making it free to move within the system in random.
Okay. So when the sunlight hits the semiconductor, it essentially makes the semiconductor act like a normal conductor wherein an electron is free to move in the system. Here we have a lattice structure of a silicon atom forming a covalent bond with 4 neighboring atoms. Now, silicon is one of the more famous semiconductors, having 4 valence electrons, exactly 4 valence electrons. Now here we have what we call doping. If you remember in our previous subjects, doping is the introducing of impurities in the silicon in order to make it exhibit certain properties. Now, how does the solar cell work? Could you guys please read this again?
How do solar cells work? Another thing that is needed to achieve by the silicon semiconductor is for it to exhibit the characteristic of a battery, where there is an imbalance of charge on both sides. Therefore, 2 sides should be created, the so-called PN junction, making the 2 sides of the junction positively charged. Pure silicon, not enough to achieve this. This is achieved through doping. Doping is the addition of other substance in a semiconductor for the purpose of modifying its electrical conductivity.
Okay, so now here we have the meaning of doping. You see, in pure silicon, it's not enough to use just silicon in the making of something like a p-n junction. We need to introduce impurities or other substances. Now, what are these other substances? What substance should be used as a dopant for the silicon to become negatively charged? And on the other end of the spectrum, what substance should be used as a dopant for the silicon to become positively charged? On the n-type side, phosphorus is used as the doping materials, while on the p-type side, it is boron. Why do we use phosphorus? It's a dopant to create an n-type side. And why is boron used to create a p-type side? Well, the silicon should be doped with atoms which contain more electrons to create negatively charged silicon or with atoms which contain less electrons to create positively charged silicon. We have the table for a periodic table of elements. Here we have the silicon, and over here you can see boron, which has less electrons, thus making the silicon more positively charged. And here we have phosphorus, which in turn makes the silicon more negatively charged since it has more electrons. Here we have the lattice structure of silicon with phosphorus as a dopant. It's another representation of the lattice structure. You can see that the phosphorus is introduced as impurities. Now we have the lattice structure of silicon with boron as dopants. Here we see that one pair is too short, meaning that there is an absence of electrons or positive charge. Now here's the lattice structure of a p-n junction in the solar panel, where in the n-type, there's an extra electron here. And in the p-type, there is a missing electron, or what we call holes. And here we have the p-n junction. See, in the p-n junction, positively charged holes are attracted near the negatively charged electrons here, but they cannot go to each other. Now, when the sunlight strikes this, it enables them to flow. Now, when there is a flow of electrons, we have what we call current. Since there is a rush of electrons from the n side towards the p side, the charge of the two sides will be reversed, making the boron-doped p side slightly negative and the phosphorus-doped n side slightly positive. Now we have the depletion region, wherein the positively charged holes go into the negative charge. They are attracted to each other but are blocked in the depletion region. The rush of electrons will quickly form a barrier between the two sides called the depletion region. In here, equilibrium is being reached when the electron stops flowing. An electric field is definitely created. The silicon junction is now exhibiting a characteristics of a battery, since there is a positively charged side and a negatively charged side. Now here we have the p-n junction when it is struck by sunlight. You can see that the holes are being filled, or there is a flow of electrons. Here we see the electron hole pair generation. Now, sunlight enters the n-type side, then penetrates the depletion region. This process knocks an electron out of the bond as many as it can, creating a pair of free electron and holes in the depletion region. The electric field drives the pair out of the depletion region. The free electron goes into the n-type side and the holes in the p-type side, resulting in higher concentration of both. This knocking of the electrons and the making of holes is what we call the current. Thus, this is enough to power something. It generates electricity or EMF. When loads are being connected to the both sides, electrons from the n-type side begins to flow, recombining with holes towards the p-type side. We all know that this is unidirectional. Flow of electrons is direct current. Now, could one of you please read this?
So practically in solar panel, the top layer, which is the n-type side, is thin and heavily doped, while the bottom type side is thick and lightly doped. So this results into bigger depletion region, thus free electron and hole pair is being generated in a wider area, which in turn produces more electricity.
Now here we have the system or the representation of parts of the system of a photovoltaic system. We have the source of the sunlight, which is the sun, which enters the photovoltaic cells. This, what we discussed before, the depletion region, the holes and the free electrons, generates unidirectional current or DC, which then transfers into an inverter. Now, this inverter can vary. It has many different types. It can have like a battery filtering system wherein batteries are used to buffer the electricity coming from the solar panels, since they are of varying voltages depending on the intensity of sunlight. They can also be direct solar cells that power an inverter, which is converted into AC here, and is connected to the service panel, which is connected to the utility meter, and in turn is connected to the low voltage to high voltage step-up transformer and distributed in the utility grid. Step-up transformers are required to boost the 480 to 690 volt inverter output voltage to the 13.8 kilovolt to 46 kilovolt of the medium voltage utility network. It is then connected to a substation for distribution into a residential area. When installed at a site, solar modules are wired together in series to form strings. Strings of modules are connected in parallel to, when necessary, to form an array. In a traditional photovoltaic plant, single centralized inverter provides the voltage inversion. Here we have an example of a big solar cell plant, the Badla Solar Park in India. Could one of you please read this?
The Calatagan Solar Farm is 63.3 megawatt solar power plant in Calatagan, Batangas, owned by Solar Philippines. It was reported that the groundbreaking for the solar facility was done as early as March 2015. Solar Philippines, a local company, developed the project, which cost 5.7 billion. The facility was built by 2,500 people in a 160 hectares land near the foot of Mount San Pedro. Upon its completion, the solar farm has 200,000 panels.
Yeah. Could one of you please read this again?
So majority of the funds for the project cost was shouldered by the Philippines business banks. So Banco de Oro, China Bank, and the Bank of Commerce also provided funds. So by the end of February, the Latagan Solar Farm is already generating power weeks before the deadline set by the Department of Energy of March 15, 2016.
Thank you. Now we're done with the photovoltaic systems. Now we move on to another version of solar energy, which is the solar thermal system, also called CSP. Now, solar thermal power plant utilizes the heat energy from the sun to heat a fluid to high temperature. Now, this fluid is then transferred from into the water, which then becomes superheated steam. This steam is used to turn a steam turbine in a power plant, and thus this mechanical energy, this rotation, is converted into electricity using a generator. These systems use solar collectors, particularly mirrors, to concentrate the sun's rays on one point to achieve appropriately high temperatures. Could one of you please enumerate these types of solar thermal systems?
Okay, so type of solar thermal systems, also called the CSP. So parabolic true solar tower, linear Fresnel reflector, and last parabolic dash. So
Okay.
note, despite there are severe different types, SDS operates same principles. They only differ in the manner of collecting sunlight and concentrating to a certain point.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so despite the differing types of solar thermal systems, they essentially do one thing, which is concentrate the heat energy or the light given off by the sun into a singular point in order to heat up a material. Okay, so now we have different types of solar thermal systems, right? Now, but actually their principle of operation stays the same, wherein they focus the light energy or the heat energy from the sun from a big area and focuses it on a smaller area, thus heating it up to a certain point. First, we have a parabolic troughs. A parabolic trough is a set of concave mirrors that concentrate solar rays on the receiver tube that is located in the focus. These troughs can track the sun around one axis, typically oriented north-south, to ensure the highest possible efficiency. The collector sometimes utilizes a single axis solar tracking system to track the sun across the sky as it moves from east to west, to ensure that there is always maximum solar energy incident on the mirrors. The receiver pipe in the center can reach temperatures of upwards of 400 degrees centigrade, as the trough focuses the sun at 30 to 100 times its normal intensity. Here we have the parabolic troughs. So from the term parabolic, meaning that it resembles a parabola, it focuses the lights that hit its parabolic shape here and focuses it here in the center, which contains the liquid to be heated. Here is another sample of parabolic troughs in a different orientation. You can see these things are actually not hard mounted. They can move about. They actually track the sun. And here we see the piping for the superheated liquid. Here we have the diagram for the parabolic troughs. We see the sunlight hitting the troughs and getting reflected into this here, the central heat pipe, wherein the fluid flows in cold and flows out hot. We have the rotational axis moving from east to west, following the sunlight. And we have the parabolic shaped reflective trough, and we have reflective coating mirrors inside the trough. Here we have the diagram for how it generates for electricity. Here we see solar trough field, but this can apply to most of the solar thermal systems, wherein they heat up a liquid, in this case hot salt right here, and it is the heat from the that liquid is then transferred here into the water. The liquid itself is not in direct contact with the water, but is instead the heat is instead transferred here in the steam boiler, wherein the heat transfer up here into the steam turbine, which spins it and in turn turns the generator. Now we move on to another diagram. It's another more basic diagram for parabolic troughs, wherein the cold salt tank here enters the heat center of the parabolic troughs. It's then superheated and then transferred here into the steam generator, which heats up the water and in turn turns the turbine. Here we see the heat exchanger, wherein the hot salt exchanges its heat energy into the water. Cooler before, the water enters and becomes steam as it exits. Hot salt, hot or liquid, enters here, dumps all its heat energy into the water, and becomes cooler afterwards. Here we see the different types of flows: the concurrent flow, the counter-current flow, the cross flow, and the cross-counter flow, which is just a bunch of different ways to pipe this heat exchanger. All have their own pros and cons. Here we see the massive heat exchanger. You can see the massive amount of reinforcement because we are dealing with very high pressures. Here is the heat exchanger. These pipes right here contain, they flow through the hot liquid. In the previous slide, we see that it was salt, and water is pumped through here. This is the insides of the heat exchanger. Many little tubes or capillaries are used to basically radiate out the heat into the water. See here, the shell. The water goes inside this pipe and the hot liquid goes inside these little capillary tubes here. Here is an example of the steam turbine. These blades right here are what gets powered by the steam, the high pressure of the steam, and in turn rotate the generator. We have another version of the parabolic troughs. You can see that they are not hard mounted here. They actually move in an axis of west to east or east to west. Could one of you please read the first two lines?
So, parabolic troughs. So, heat from the sun is being collected by special mirrors, which is reflected to the pipe that runs through down the middle of the troughs. So, within the center of the pipe is a heat transfer fluid flowing inside it. The HTF inside the pipe can reach a temperature around 400 degrees as the trough focuses sun of 30 to 100 times its normal intensity.
Okay, so now here is the operating principle summarized, wherein the heat collected is focused, and then the heat transfer fluid is superheated and transfers its heat into the water, which in turn boils it into high pressure superheated steam. The steam then moves the turbine to power the generator and thus producing electricity. The HTF keeps circulating within the system. The steam is condensed and sent back through the heat exchanger, and the process continues. Heat transfer fluids. Could one of you please read this?
So heat transfer fluids. So in a solar thermal system, heat transfer fluid or HTF is a liquid or a gas specially manufactured for the purpose of transmitting heat from one system to another.
Thank you. Now you might be wondering why we don't just heat up the water directly. Well, these heat transfer fluids act as like a battery wherein they buffer the heat energy. They can store much more heat energy as opposed to water. So these are the heat transfer fluids are stored in a tank which preserves their heat energy to be used as to boil the water. Essentially, you can think of the heat transfer fluids as batteries in the solar thermal system. Now, here is another what I was talking about. Why use HTF instead of direct system in which water is instantly turned into steam? Now, these working fluids have high heat capacity, as I was saying before. They can maintain the high amount of hotness for a long period of time. That is why in CSP, large volume of HTF is heated and elevated temp during daytime where sunlight intensity is at its peak. That then it is being stored in a tight vessel. It acts as a reserve power that can be used during cloudy days when the sun's intensity is at its peak, lowest, or during nighttime where there is totally no presence of sunlight. It essentially acts as a backup or a battery to buffer when the sunlight gets weak. The heat transfer fluids used in CSP technologies include air, water, molten salts, what we saw before in the figure or the diagrams that we explained, glycol-based, glycerol-based, and synthetic oils. The following characteristics are being considered on what type of HTF is to be used in a solar thermal plant: the operating temperature, the life cycle, the heat transfer capacity, heat storage aspect, and the overall safety. Would one of you please read this?
So parabolic dish. So parabolic dish systems use mirrors that are mounted over a parabolic shaped dish to focus the sun's rays onto a receiver. So the latter is mounted at the local point of the dish along with the heat engine, which has the thin tubes inside it. So this ensures that they always receive the highest possible amount of incoming solar radiation that they then concentrate at the focal point of the dish. So these dishes can concentrate sunlight much better than the parabolic throws, and the fluid run through them can reach temperature upwards of 750 degrees Celsius.
Thank you. Now, the
So,
parabolic dishes, principle of operation stays the same, wherein they focus the sunlight and into a liquid which heats it up and powers a steam turbine. Now, here we have the Stirling engine, and you guys might be familiar with this. It's basically a heat engine operated by cyclic compression and expansion of other gases, the working fluid, at different temperatures, resulting in a net conversion of heat energy into mechanical work. More specifically, the Stirling engine is a closed cycle regenerative heat engine with a permanent gaseous working fluid. Closed cycle in this context means thermodynamic system in which the working fluid is permanently contained within the system, and regenerative describes the use of a specific type of internal heat exchanger and thermal store known as the regenerator. Strictly speaking, the inclusion of the regenerator is what differentiates a Stirling engine from other closed cycle hot air engines. Here we have the parabolic dish. Instead of using a trough, it uses a dish to focus the sunlight energy, but the principle of operation remains the same. It collects the heat, the sunlight, and focuses it on this spot. It kind of looks like a parabolic antenna. We have the diagram in a parabolic dish solar farm. Here we have the GIF of the Stirling engine. You can see the closed system, what we learned before in thermodynamics, I believe. As it heats up, it expands here, thus moving the piston back and forth. This creates a torque, a rotation, continuous rotation, such as with a steam turbine. Now we have the solar tower working principle. Could one of you please read this?
So, solar tower working principle. So, the principle of the solar tower is the same as that of the solar throw. Focus sunlight onto a solar receiver where a heat transfer fluid can be heated, and the heat carried away to generate electricity. The solar power tower system uses a large field of flat, sun-tracking mirrors called heliostats to reflect and concentrate sunlight onto a receiver onto the top of a tower. Sunlight can be concentrated as much as 1,500 times. Some power towers use water as the heat transfer fluid.
Thank you. So now we have another flavor of the solar thermal power plants. We have the solar tower. Here we have a bunch of heliostats. These are the things that reflect the sunlight into the tower itself. The tower, there is a water, cold water flowing into the tower, which gets superheated and becomes steam into, which gets fed into the steam turbine itself. We have a very nice example of the solar towers. You can see all of these panels are focusing the sunlight into this part right here. Here we have another diagram. You can see here, this combined what we saw before, wherein they use heat transfer fluids to basically act as a battery and preserve the heat energy in order to heat up more of the water more for a longer period of time. Finally, we have the linear pressure reflectors. Gonna be please read this.
So, linear pressure reflector. So, power plants uses a series of long, narrow, shallow curvature mirrors to focus lights onto one or more linear receivers positioned above the mirrors. So, on top of the receiver, a small parabolic mirrors can be attached for the further focusing of the light. The solar concentrator Fresnel lens product catalog, linear Fresnel lens about linear Fresnel lenses. So linear Fresnel lenses are flat cylindrical lenses that condense or diffuse light in a linear direction.
Thank you. Yet another flavor of solar thermal power plants. It's another spin on focusing the sunlight into a specific point. Here we have a bunch of reflectors laying on the ground here. They reflect the sunlight into the secondary reflector, which in turn reflects it into the absorber tube. The absorber tube gets heated, and it contains the transfer fluid, which gets superheated. We have a diagram of the linear Fresnel reflectors. See here, cold water is fed and comes back as steam into the hot tank. And it goes into the heat exchanger, turning more water into steam, which drives the turbines. We have a bunch of peripherals such as the feed water tank, the feed water pump, and the air-cooled condenser, which cools down the steam into water again to be fed right back into the heat exchanger and back into the turbine as a cycle. We have a real-life example of these types of solar thermal power plants. You can see the secondary reflector here focusing into the collector. We have the compact linear Fresnel reflectors. We have the linear tracking reflectors that tracks sunlight, and in order to focus it into the linear absorbers, you have the compact linear Fresnel reflector, focusing it into a single spot compared to the previous ones. Finally, we have the largest solar thermal power stations in the world. Could one of you please enumerate the first two?
So the first is Warsasate Solar Power Station, which has a capacity of 510 megawatts from Morocco, and it has a parabolic true and solar tower type. So date of construction is 2018, and the area is 2,500 hectares. So next is Ivanpah Solar Power Facility, which has a capacity of 392 and located in USA. So the type is solar tower, and it constructed on the year 2014. So it has a total area of 1,420 hectares.
Thank you. You can see these are very recent thermal power stations. The latest, oldest of which came from 2012, which is from Spain, 200 megawatts. We have the Quarzasat solar power station. It's a solar tower power station right here. You can see the large area. All of these panels reflect the sunlight back into this black point here on the tower. There is continuous water flowing into this black spot, which gets superheated into steam and then goes into the steam turbine. You can see that the generators itself are actually pales in comparison compared to the amount of space required just to reflect the sunlight. We have the largest solar thermal power station, which is the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Solar Park Phase 4, which should have a capacity of 600 and 100 megawatts in Dubai or the United Arab Emirates. It's a parabolic trough and a solar tower, but take note, it is still under construction. So this is a theoretical capacity of 600 and 100 watts. We found our sources here, and that's all. Thank you for listening.